Hello and welcome to Season 2 of Inside the Therapy Room. I'm your host, Sam Sellers. I'm a registered therapist, a wife and a fur mama, and I am passionate about breaking down the barriers and stigma attached to therapy. I want to begin by first honouring the traditional custodians of the land we live and work on. Today, Sarah is on Yorta Yorta land and Sam is on Gundungurra land. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions and cultures of our First Nations people. We must always remember the land below our feet is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. Today we are chatting to Sarah Martin, who is an accredited social worker currently working in the capacity of a social worker with a regional hospital, as well as part-time private practice. Sarah specialises in child-centred play therapy, Filial Therapy, Circle of Security Program Facilitation, AutPlay and EMDR. Sarah has worked in and out of home care, community youth and family organisations, and managed youth programs focusing on supporting young people, families and education management. Her clinical experience includes Specialist Behaviour Support, child and adolescent mental health and developmental trauma. Sarah's practice, Connect to Thrive, is where she uses therapeutic interventions that are grounded in attachment theory, neuroscience, and interpersonal neurobiology. Today's episode is all about play therapy. We hope you enjoy joining us inside the therapy room. Welcome, Sarah. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I've been loving chatting to everybody. And today we're talking about play therapy. So I remember reading your bio and I was thinking, wow, this woman is very qualified in a vast majority of different things. Tell us a little bit about you and what you do and the different types of things that you work with before we jump into play therapy specifically.
Yeah, no worries. So I'm an accredited social worker, and I have a small private practice so I do that part-time because I also have a part-time employment position as well, but have been practicing as a play therapist now for about 5 years. However, I've been working with children and families for 20. And I live in regional Victoria, and here it can at times be difficult to access services and supports, and that can often leave families, I guess, struggling but not quite sure on where to go.
Yeah.
So I have worked in various positions in different communities around my area, and a focus has really been around how do we strengthen communities and support our community the best way we can.
Yeah.
So yeah, I originally started off when I left high school. I actually studied youth work.
Okay.
So I went to my Bachelor of Youth Studies and ended up working in out-of-home care. So young people in residential care. And I guess that was my first exposure to developmental trauma.
Yeah.
And it was through that experience. I was fairly young. I was 22 years old, and working with young people who are experiencing, some really horrific life circumstances. And for someone who, I grew up in a Catholic family. I had both my mum and my dad. I guess I was somewhat protected. However, I also grew up in an area of Melbourne that was quite renowned, and so exposed to things as well. And I remember being an adolescent thinking, I wish that there was somewhere I could turn to get some help or some support, and someone who I could talk to. And it just wasn't really available. And I guess that's what led me into working with young people, because I didn't want other young people to not feel that they didn't have someone that they could connect with in times of challenges. So, and then it just ended up moving in from there. I never, when I was in my 20s, I never thought that I would be where I was now.
Yeah. out of home care is a tough gig. My wife has worked with she's been a foster care caseworker and a youth worker and things like that, and so I know very well that it's a tough gig. So I can only imagine, I guess, what that would have been like for 22-year-old who is probably working with teenagers who might only be 5 years younger than you.
Exactly right.
And sort of going, wow. And it being just heartbreaking as well. So because, it is not only the trauma that they've experienced from their families, but the system is not exactly the most whole system. It is a fairly broken system itself. And so trauma from that as well, which is difficult. But
absolutely, without a doubt. And just the experience, I mean, it was incredibly rewarding, though, as hard as it was at times as a young person myself. We know adolescence is now, up to the age of 25, and here I was as an adolescent working with other people who were, a young person. So, and I did that for quite a few years. And when I moved into regional Victoria, I stepped into intensive case management for what was then, the name then was intensive case management with our high-risk population, high-risk adolescents. And that was amazing. As challenging at times that it was a really amazing position. And I really appreciate it. And that's where I decided that I was going to go off and do further study. And so I did my master's in social work.
Yep.
And just continued to grow because I wanted to go into clinical work. I wanted to be able to work with children and families so that we could hopefully over time prevent young people entering our out-of-home care systems. And so if we can help heal and work with vulnerable people in vulnerable situations, then hopefully thinking about, how do we plant those seeds and how do we help growth over time for people? And that's where I ended up moving towards, was going into clinical work and community-based work and different things like that over time.
Amazing. So for people who don't know, tell us what play therapy is.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I'm going to focus more so on what is child-centered play therapy, because that is the roots of my my framework. And when we talk about play therapy, as in any therapy, in adult therapy, we know that there's lots of different modalities within that, and there's different ways of being able to practice and different ways of being able to gauge. Sometimes people might talk about directive and non-directive. So within play therapy, there's lots of different modalities, and there's also different programs and schools of thought within play therapy. And we have some amazing entrepreneurs now who are building up their own play therapy modalities too. And really bringing in a lot of the new research and findings that we have from neuroscience and, the work of, in terms of the polyvagal theory and just learning about our nervous systems a lot more and how our brains work, essentially, from a neurobiology perspective. So, I think it's a really interesting stage of play therapy to ask, what is play therapy? Because I feel that it's in this real transitional stage, and there's lots of parts to it because there's different ways of training, there's different ways of providing child-led therapy. But historically, play therapy is grounded in psychoanalytic schools of thought. So from Anna Freud back in the early 1900s and Melanie Klein. And it's traditionally been acknowledged, they're traditionally acknowledged as the developers of play therapy. And over the years, it continued to grow, and through the work of Virginia Axline in the mid-20th century. And she was also heavily influenced by Carl Rogers, who is the person, he works on that person-centered model. And it was lovely. Virginia was one of Carl Rogers' students, and so they worked really closely together to build what we now call child-centered play therapy. At the time, it was non-directive child therapy. And so as the years go on, we have different people who then become leaders within the training. And so I guess there's always shifts that change within that. But the core belief, however, from Carl Rogers is the belief of children's ability to self-heal and for them to be able to solve through their own problems, and leading from that non-directive technique within play therapy, and knowing that children have the power to heal and they have the power to be able to do that within themselves. And as the therapist, we are working alongside them and helping them to be able to make sense of their inner world through their expression of play. So within that context of play, children are able to express themselves using play and the play-based materials within the room, be that in the room. But there's also lots of really different ways in which people are providing therapy. It doesn't just have to be in the therapy room, which is amazing. My session today was in a home. And with a parent and a child, it's being able to, in schools, it's out in nature. So there's lots of different ways that we are able to do that. But the essential part of that is that therapeutic relationship, that safe and trusting relationship that the therapist is able to build with the child.
Amazing. And I know that there is a part of play therapy. I don't work with children, so I'm drawing back on all of the knowledge that I have in my head, that there is a form within play therapy that is about sort of involving the parents and and having them be the most important person for a child, and for them to be involved in that play therapy experience as well, isn't there?
Yes, and I'm so loving that you mentioned that, because there's different ways of thinking about this. So there is what we call the filial therapy model, okay, and so the Gurney's model, and Louise and Bernard Gurney developed the filial therapy model, which was influenced by CCPT, and Gary Landreth also in the early 2000s. He stepped into this space also, and he has his model of filial therapy as well. However, bringing parents into the play therapy room, it is, I guess, adaptive and changing towards how the therapist is supporting the parent within the therapeutic process. For me, the way that I'm, I guess, working with parent and child in that space is building the relationship. And so it's working from an attachment-based model. And it's helping to be alongside the parent, and it's seeing the parent as part of that therapeutic change for the child. Because ultimately, like one session a week of therapy for a child, it's unrealistic to think that we're going to be able to have long-term change outcomes, because, if we think about, behavior change models, it's, to change the behavior, you need to change the environment. Well, for many young people, if they're in multiple different systems, then how do we support the systems to understand the child and also be part of that therapeutic process for the child?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I think it's beautiful work.
Yeah, I find that approach is a very holistic way of looking at it, of going, the reality is, and I will say this even to my adult clients, an hour a week is not going to change things. There needs to be things that are done outside of this space. And so I think, it's a much more holistic and realistic way of looking at building that sense of self and that attachment for the children. Is there a point or an age where play therapy becomes redundant?
That's a really interesting question, because play is a form of expression?
Mm-hmm.
So no, essentially no, I don't think so. I know of clinicians that use play therapy with their adult population. They're using Sandtray therapy with their adult population, and it's amazing work. And incredibly important work, because for a lot of adults, it might not feel comfortable for them to use cognitive-based approaches or talk-based therapy, but being able to express it was amazing. When I was doing my training, it was part of it was, being able to explore your own experience of play therapy. And so doing your own therapy through play. And I was amazed at some of the things that were just naturally coming out through my own process of doing it. Like, oh, wow, okay. And I'm in my 30s and this stuff is coming up. So it's incredibly powerful. And I think playfulness in any form of therapy is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I find the more that I can get my clients to use their imagination and the creative side of their brain, the more in touch with their own internal world they are, because I think the more we try and keep it in that logical, theoretical thought space, we lose so much ability to explore. But we do tend to just lose that imagination part of ourselves as we get older. It just tends to happen naturally. If you don't use it, then you lose it. So,
well, I think it's also because the higher parts of our brain are more in order.
Yeah.
And so we're more likely to be cognitive based, and we naturally want to know whys. As we get older, we want to be able to break down and understand, and for some, being able to work from a very cognitive based model may be more comfortable for them, as opposed to being able to go into their inner world or their expressive world, because it's not something that feels comfortable or safe for them.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it can absolutely be a process of getting people to feel comfortable in connecting to their body, because I find that all of our expressive therapies are about connecting to the body. And for many, the body, is a place of pain and hardship, and it stores memories and it stores experiences in ways that for many we might want to dissociate from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there particular presentations, issues, or problems that children might be experiencing that can benefit more so from something like play therapy?
Look, play is a child's natural way of expression and their natural way of learning. And so I think if it is really appropriate to be able to use play for lots of different reasons, speeches are using it, OTs use play-based therapy, so in terms of from a mental health perspective, I guess common referral reasons that I might have are children who are dealing with parental separation, so parental anxieties, children who have experienced family violence, children who have been hospitalized or experienced medical procedures. And that's a real big one, because children aren't understanding what's happening to them. And often we are trying to tell them through communication why the doctor's needing to do things, or why we have to do these, or why something is so painful but yet so important. No child, no human being wants to be in pain, let alone a child whose safety response system is being completely activated, and we're in that state. So, therapy is an incredibly important process for children who have experienced medical trauma, or even prolonged medical procedures. The children who, chemotherapy, for an example, huge one.
Yeah.
So There's also children who've experienced trauma. It might have, sexual, emotional, physical traumas, psychological traumas, children who are part of the care system, adopted or otherwise, or even they may have been removed from home for a period of time. It might be that children are having difficulties in their social development. And so being able to help build their social capacity. Developmental delays. Now with the NDIS, we are seeing a lot more therapists providing play therapy for children in that early years space because of developmental delays. And so a common thing might be, child's referred to build on their play skills, for example. And then if that's the case, sometimes a bit more directive work because we're building up their functional skills. Then there's also, a child might be experiencing problems at school. Parents might be going through a separation or recently separated, divorced. Challenges around attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So children who have ADHD, sadly, their environments haven't understood them very well.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're getting a narrative that you don't listen.
They're naughty.
Yeah, you're naughty. Your name, you're excluded. And that child is simply overwhelmed. They could be experiencing an overwhelm of a sensory presentation. It could be the visual input, the lights, the sounds. People with ADHD find it really hard to be able to block things out. If there's something that's happening outside, the ability to be able to hear what the teacher's saying is compromised because, wait, I can see and hear that something's going on. And so they're easily distracted.
I would imagine that play therapy in general would be good, I guess, for neurodivergent kids.
Absolutely, which is the bulk of the work that I do and that I love.
Yeah. Especially kids who may be nonverbal as well. I think it's really easy for people to think that therapy, you have to be able to talk. And I think, opens so many doors for children who might be nonverbal to start building some of those skills in a really gentle capacity.
Absolutely. And I tend not to use the words nonverbal. I tend to use communication in different ways.
Yeah.
Because our spoken language is only one form of communication.
Yeah.
And that is the beauty and the magic of play. You don't need words to play.
No. Yeah.
There's so many other ways that we do that. And I have worked with children with selective mutism.
Yeah.
And we might be engaging really differently, and that's okay.
Yeah.
So there's lots of different ways to be able to do that, and particularly for children where parents are querying neurodiversity. It's another really great way to use play therapy and helping the child to be able to understand who they are, and parents being able to find a different way of connecting with their child. Just because it's not the way that the parenting books said that it was going to look and feel like, it's still there. We just feel it differently.
And I would imagine that would be incredibly empowering for those parents to be able to find personalized ways to connect with their children, especially when they would be feeling like they've done everything that they can. So what is it like in the room? I guess this the podcast is called Inside the Therapy Room. What is it like? What are the sorts of things that you might be doing in a session? You mentioned sand tray therapy. There are obviously a multitude of different things, but what sort of play is happening in those rooms?
Yeah, great question. Well, it very much depends on the stage of therapy a child's at, and depends on the presentation of the child, what's bringing them to therapy, and what are our goals and what are the things that the child is working on within their inner world. Within child-centered play therapy, we look at the stages of therapy, so 4 stages of therapy, but then also the themes within the therapy. And so what might be happening within a child's play is going to be varied depending on where they're at in their therapeutic process. So the stages within that therapeutic process for child-centered play therapy is we have the initial warm-up stage. And within that, it is around building that therapeutic alliance. It's around being able to, the beautiful work of Carl Rogers and Virginia Axline in their work of being able, the 8 guiding principles, of establishing, we establish acceptance, a caring environment that is safe for the child, it's non-judgmental, the child is able to freely express and explore their emotions, and it's being able to, and the child being able to gauge what this now looks like, what is this relationship, and what does this look like. So that's that warm-up stage. And then we move into usually around is testing for protection. And testing for protection can sometimes, people might call that aggression stage of therapy. There's lots of different ways in which therapists might describe this stage. But essentially, this is when children tend to work on some of their underlying issues that are central to their behaviours or the concerns that they've experienced throughout their life experiences. One of the really important things, I think, for us to understand is that sometimes there have been experiences that children have that was pre-verbal or before we actually developed the memory, that we might have a sensation.
Yeah.
And this is where the tuning in by the therapist, by really understanding those themes that come up within the play, is so critically important. And being able to have such a comprehensive intake and case conceptualization, because things might be happening, and being able to, for the therapist to be able to tune in what's happening to them and what are they feeling, what's happening within them and happening within the child, and making sense of that experience so that we are able to put words to that child's experience for them.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you say to a parent who sort of is thinking, well, my kids play at home, so what's the difference?
Yeah. The difference is the way in which children play.
Yeah.
Yep. It is within that therapeutic context, the child quickly sees that this is different, and they're seeing that there is a different way in which the adult is engaged with them. They're not preoccupied. Usually at home, children play, but the parent might be, oh, there's a knock at the door, so they've got to go get the knock. They've got to answer the phone, or dinner's on the stove, and so we're in and out of connection and relationship through that play with the child. And within therapy, we're not. We are centered on the child, and we're centered in that relationship and the connection with the child. And it is also, there are materials within the toy room that we probably don't have at home.
Yeah.
Some of my materials have come from the States. It's the only place I can access them. So
yeah.
I can assure you that there's many places that, some of those materials that are designed to help be expressive tools for children. Yeah. I just think that understanding the different themes within a child's play shows us why play at home can be different to playing the therapy with the therapist. And you were asking before about parents engaged in a child's therapy. Well, filial therapy is the model of where the therapist is essentially teaching or guiding alongside the parent to give them some of those therapeutic play-based tools for the child.
Yeah.
And holding play therapy sessions, or therapeutic play at home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can play therapy be done in a group format, or is it mainly one-on-one?
It can be done in groups, so there is group play therapy models. I have not gone into the space of doing non-directive group play therapy, simply because the space that I have hasn't been able to provide that. And you usually want more than one therapist to be doing it, because holding the emotional world of more than one child is it's hard work.
Yes.
So
and the attention span.
And you've got to be so attuned.
Yes.
And so attuning not only to the child's world, but it's your world. So now we're attuning to this child and myself and whatever else is happening within the play, and how we need to then set boundaries. I have done sibling play therapy, which is beautiful. Like it's a really empowering therapy when you have the siblings together. Really starting to see those changes that are happening within family dynamics.
You've mentioned directive and non-directive a couple of times. Where might you use directive play therapy?
Okay. Sometimes as the kiddos are getting older, or I am working more so say for a child who may be referred for a particular challenge, and it's a particular area that we might need to be focusing on. So then I might use more directive work. Or if I'm using TheraPlay, which is directive. So TheraPlay is a form of therapy with parent and child, and it's based on, and it's building attachment connection between parent and child. And that's quite directive, because you are directing the games, so to speak. They're not really games, but they are therapeutic engagement tools to support that parent and the child connecting together in the therapy. So that's quite directive. There's also, it might be using EMDR in play therapy as well. Sometimes that might be more directive or based work as well. Again, I would use that with my older kiddos as opposed to my younger. If I was using EMDR with my younger kiddos, I'd still be using a non-directive approach.
Often therapists will talk in terms of the tools that they have, but you would have literal tools in your room, literal things that you can pick up and play with, as opposed to it being something that you might use verbally with a client. You would have literal things to use. What are some of those things? What might we find in that play therapy room?
Okay. So tools that you might see, you might have some sort of tent. There's usually a kitchen, medical equipment, safety equipment. We've got our aggression regression toys, dolls, babies, nurturing, expressive arts. We have lots of different expressive pieces of equipment. One of my most favorite things is using a bot bag. They're really cool. And interestingly, it's not always used for kids just to punch and kick. So many kiddos are using it actually for pressure input, and it's to actually being able to regulate the body through pressure and rolling and balancing and testing themselves on it and testing their skills. And so, yes, we have all of that equipment, but Lisa Dion, who's the creator of Synergetic Play Therapy, her most amazing phrase is, you are the most important tool in the playroom. And so we can have all of the most expensive toys or most special toys, but ultimately the therapist is the most important toy in the playroom.
Absolutely. This is my favorite question to ask everybody who I've been chatting with, which is, what myth do you want to smash about play therapy? Because I would think that there is some misconceptions. And I've had to have conversations with, parents that I've worked with who do think that play therapy is, just paying somebody else to play with your child and things like that. So what myth do you see coming up, or misconception do you see coming up a lot?
I would say that play therapy is a really valuable discipline. It is a really important therapy modality, and it is incredibly important to be able to work at the developmental stage of the child and not the age. We're working with the child's development and where they are at on their own journey. And that play therapy can change little people's lives, and it can change the lives of their families. It's an incredible modality, and it can really bolster children for them later in life when they might be faced with different difficulties or adversities or challenges. And being able to, the sooner that we can engage our children in therapy, if we are concerned, the greater outcomes that we have for them. Some of the misconceptions are that there are various disciplines and practitioners who are able to provide play therapy. I think because we are so largely led with our Medicare system under the mental health care plan system, that, children can only see a psychologist for behaviour therapy.
Yeah.
That if there's a behaviour issue, they have to see a psychologist for behaviour therapy. And yes, while that might be incredibly important, absolutely. However, don't disregard other disciplines. There are amazing OTs out there who are trained in different forms of play therapy. There are social workers, who have been doing this work for many years. So there's different disciplines and practitioners out there who are providing this. And my advice to people who are seeking a therapist is have a conversation with them, and get to know them and ask the questions and notice how you feel in connection with that therapist. Ask them the tough questions.
Yes, we love the tough questions.
Because ultimately, as a parent or as a caregiver, you need to feel completely safe and comfortable with who your child is engaging in therapy with, because ultimately that therapist might be asking you to be part of their therapeutic process.
Yes,
and if
absolutely.
and if they don't feel safe with them, like, how is that child going to feel safe? As parent, our children are connected to us. They see us, they feel us. And so we need to be authentic within that. And the myth, play therapy is not just play. It might look like that, but there's so much knowledge and understanding and particular responses that go into it. And therapists are really well trained. We are not just doing a weekend course. There's lots of training and ongoing training and professional development that goes into it. Many practitioners are engaged in their own therapy. They're engaged in supervision. So I encourage parents to ask those questions. Do you have regular supervision?
Absolutely. And I think when it comes to kids, I do family therapy. So children, that's the only sort of time that I will see children is when it's a family therapy model. But whenever children are in therapy, it's never just the children, it's a family affair. You can't sort of get away from that as parents, because it's, everything is so interconnected as a family system that it's very, very rarely ever going to just be a solitary thing for the child. It always is going to include the parent. So you need to feel comfortable with who you're entrusting to come into your internal world and landscape as a family. So I could not agree more. Ask those questions, and don't be afraid to ask what might seem like an obvious question, because
Absolutely.
yeah, if you have the question, you want the answer, essentially. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
And therapy is an investment.
Yeah.
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 Parents are working hard
Yeah.
to be able to pay for their child to engage in ongoing therapy. And play therapy or child-centered play therapy, it is not a quick modality. It is not a therapy where your child's going to see a therapist for 5 times and everything's going to be resolved. Expect anything up to about 20 sessions. And if they've experienced attachment disruption, medical traumas, as well as trauma, abuse, family violence, all those sorts of things, you're looking at far more extensive period of time in therapy.
Yeah.
And that's a really important thing to understand, because the child has so many different parts that they are working through. And the importance of, when you're talking about the parent and the family systems and things like that being involved, one of the stages within play therapy that we talk about is this regression stage. And regression can look like, that 2-step backwards. And sometimes it can leave parents going, but it's not working. Like they're now not sleeping properly. They're wanting to sleep in my bed. They're getting really fussy with what they're eating. Their toileting has gone backwards. They're doing this baby talk, and they're no longer able to do these things themselves. They're more hyperactive, or their tensions are increasing. Like, why isn't this working? However, and that's where the engagement and the trust in your therapist is so important, because they're going to help you understand that for many children, regression can occur before they make that developmental leap.
Yeah.
And so it can sometimes be that phase of before there's going to be a growth. And for children, growth is usually some form of building independence. And when children achieve a new developmental milestone, as parents, we might celebrate that and be really happy. It's like, oh, they're doing this now and it's fantastic. I don't have to do that, be as responsible for that anymore. But actually, for the child, there is a loss for them in terms of they're also less dependent on the parent. And so there is a new form of separation between parent and child. And sometimes that can feel really unsettling for the child. So it's great for them to be independent and to build that sense of self. But then what does that narrative look like for the child to feel that step further removed and separated from their parent and needing that closeness from them?
Absolutely.
So I think that's where relationships are so important, because we get to be part of that understanding with parents.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's not uncommon for, say, a medical specialist or a GP or something to sort of say about a particular condition or an injury that it might get worse before it gets better, sort of mentality. And so you need to have that same level of trust in your therapist as you would your a knee specialist or something like that, who is going in and fixing a joint so that it can heal better. You can tell I'm not a knee specialist. But there needs to be trust on all levels when it comes to children in therapy. It is, like I said, it's a family affair most of the time. So thanks for joining me.
No worries. I will just make one part on what we were just talking about then. I do want to say, though, if parents are concerned about the quality of the therapist that they're engaged with and no longer feeling safe or contained, have a chat to another therapist and just nut that out. It is okay to raise that with your therapist and to be able to say, I'm not comfortable with this.
Yeah.
And advocate for your child and advocate for what you feel is important to them. And just because you didn't click with one therapist, it doesn't mean that you're not going to click with another. It can take time. We don't continue to see a GP who gives us poor medical advice, that we believe to be poor medical advice. If we don't feel that our GP understands our needs, then we're more likely to go and find another GP, aren't we?
Yeah.
So
we get a second opinion.
Exactly right. So I absolutely encourage therapists to do that too. So encourage parents to do that with their therapists.
Absolutely. And ideally, your therapist should be having that conversation with you as well. I'm always telling my clients that if for some reason something doesn't feel comfy for you, let's have a conversation about it, because I'm very aware that I am not everybody's therapist and I'm not supposed to be. But if I'm not, I want to help you find who is. So if your therapist is not having that conversation with you about your children or about you, take that conversation to somebody else who, consult with another play therapist or another child therapist, and get a second opinion in the same way that we would get a second opinion in the medical field. It's no different. Yeah.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So, yes. Thanks so much for joining me.
No worries. Thank you for your time.
Thanks,
and
so good.
Thanks for the interest in child-centered play therapy and wanting to share that with others.
Absolutely. I love it. I think it's wonderful. So the more people that can know that that this is an option for their children, the better. So
absolutely
wonderful.
We hope you enjoyed joining us inside the therapy room. Thanks for listening.